For our final session, Design Futuring, we seek to imagine equitable futures from which we can propose more radical design solutions in the present. Design Futuring is therefore the core principle to the new model of design practice that we are proposing. Our speakers are exploring design futuring across place and context, and we are excited to have them with us this afternoon. Presenting together, Mario Gooden and Mabel O. Wilson are both of the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University and co-directors of the Global Africa Lab. Mabel is currently writing Building Race and Nation, a book about how slavery influenced early American civic architecture, and she is also a collaborator on the team currently developing designs for the memorial to enslaved African American laborers at the University of Virginia. Mario is a principal of Huff and Gooden Architects and the author of Dark Space, Architecture, Representation, Black Identity. His work, writings, and lectures frequently examine art and architecture and the spatial politics of race, class, gender, and technology. Ingrid Lafleur is a cultural producer, arts advocate, and founder of Afrotopia. Based in Detroit, Afrotopia is an evolving creative research project that investigates the possibility of using the arts movement Afrofuturism as psychosocial healing. Within her artistic practice, Lafleur further unpacks ideas around trauma, which have been unearthed from audience engagement through Afrotopia. Y. King Garrett is a third-generation community builder, social entrepreneur, and recognized change agent from the Africa Town Central District neighborhood in Seattle, Washington. He is the chief strategist of the Africa Town Seattle Community Development Initiative, designing programs and initiatives that catalyze, mobilize, and activate communities for social impact. The session will be moderated by Stephen Gray, Assistant Professor of Urban Design at the Graduate School of Design. Please give a warm welcome to our first speakers, Mario Gooden and Mabel O. Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, wow, yeah. It is a stunningly beautiful view today in Cambridge. It's going to be tough to follow that amazing performance, and certainly food for thought. And I think part of what Mario and I want to engage is the ways in which, particularly Black peoples around the world, find other mediums through which to imagine futures and to think about, other elsewheres and otherwise. But we first wanted to thank Natasha Marcus, Amanda Armando, and Chanel for doing an amazing job for a phenomenal conference. And also to say, also just thank you for the larger group of African American students. Also want to thank the GSD for supporting this, the Graham Foundation as well. And one of the things, Mario and I are a slightly different generation, but we don't look it because Black don't crack. But I'm old. But I do want to say, just having a room like this is pretty extraordinary, because when we were students, particularly undergrads, it might have been a quarter of this space, in fact. But there were people, Sharon Sutton, Max Bond, there were amazing people who were academics and practitioners and thinkers who were really role models for us. And knowing them and also building networks, Mario and I were also classmates, and your classmates are really going to be the people, the shoulders you cry on, the people you bitch with, but also your collaborators in thinking through and finding a place for you to sort of do work here. So I just wanted to start a little with Global Africa Lab and talk about what we do. It's within GSAP at Columbia University. It was started about 5 years ago and engages in both pedagogical experimentation and also research. We work with Carson Smuts, who's a South African hardware and software designer, but a range of people, in Pomet Sipa, who's the curator of Studio X in Johannesburg, shout out from Info, Mokena Mokeka, Nancy, a number of people, Nancy Muti, Salam Makabela. We organized a conference called The Other Desires, the African City in 2016. We also have an ongoing project called Afro-Imaginaries, which is sort of what we're going to talk about, that we've been collaborating with Impo, the fantastic Kelly Jones, and Paul Goodwin, who is a curator in London. And so part of what we're going to talk about today is sort of coming out of that conversation. In terms of the history. One of the things we call it Global Africa Lab is to think globally, but also to think of the legacy of the diaspora, right? And so a lot of the work is certainly engaged in the African diaspora, in the African continent, and its relationship to the larger diaspora. It's also to think about the history of that diaspora, so that Black peoples aren't always seen at a moment of crisis, but understanding that where we are is an outcome of the forces of modernity, and that's very, very, very important. The other aspect is our method. A lot of what we've developed is a method of data spatialization in order to find these sort of hidden conditions, landscapes of inequalities, and really understanding the role of communications, technologies, and other devices that people, I think Sekou said it quite well, are hacking in order to sort of create new spaces and conditions, and that's one of the kind of tools that we look at, but we also engage in the kind of methods that we look at. But fundamentally, it's this kind of disjunctured landscape that has emerged as an outcome of modernity that's important. It's the legacy of literally European colonial expansion since the 13th century. Put that all in one word. And we're interested not only in the futures, but also the histories that basically make our present in which we begin to imagine the future. And that's something that's vital that we want to address. And we've looked at the cities of Johannesburg, Abuja, Lagos, Dakar, Rio de Janeiro, Detroit, and so Cape Town, and Harare. So a number of the projects that you're looking at are either studio projects or workshop projects that we've done with various groups of students.
Yeah, so why a discourse on Black subjectivity and representation in contemporary architectural theory and history has yet to be written? Why is this important? Despite the objection of Black beings in relationship to the white liberal subject, one that has produced an unequal landscape that diminishes Black life, in what ways do Black people imagine other possible futures? And as Mabel mentioned, some of the work that you're looking at has come out of our studios as well as workshops, one this past summer that we spent a few weeks in Harare, and we asked the students to do on-the-ground research regarding mobility, regarding infrastructure, transportation, cross-border flows, migration, and out of that to produce just one drawing, a kind of imaginary of a kind of future Harare. The initial questions that come to mind ponder the subjectivities that were relegated to the hidden kitchen entrances and rear doors of restaurants, hotels, and doctors' offices during the Jim Crow era, the subjectivities that occupy the servant positions within modernisms, and the subjectivities of the curved, feminized, primitive bodies to which modernism refers to as irrational, dangerous, and difficult, but which nevertheless signifies sensuousness in contrast to the rationality of the modernist grid, as we talked about this morning. Hence, Black subjectivity is not just an other in modern architectural discourse, architectural theory, and representation, but it represents a place of exclusion. And so we're interested in pulling that out in a number of different ways. This can be traced back, to, I guess, a major basis for that exclusion to Hegel's treatise called The Lectures on the Philosophy of History, where one of the things that he says is that the peculiarly African character is difficult to comprehend for the very reason that in reference to it, we must quite give up the principle which naturally accompanies all our ideas, the category of universality. Furthermore, following his exegesis on the Negro's want of reason and consciousness, his acceptance of slavery, and the inability to appreciate freedom, which leads to the contempt of humanity and his inability, Hegel states that from these various traits, it is manifest that the want of self-control distinguishes the character of the Negroes. This condition is capable of no development or culture, and we see them at this day such as they have always been. The only essential connection that has existed and continues between the Negroes and the Europeans is that of slavery. At this point, we must leave Africa. And whenever I read this quote, I just get so incensed. I'm like, WTF. I mean, this kind of goes back. And you can sort of trace that sort of thinking, through modernist architecture, and you sort of see that modernist architecture is tied to these ideas which have come out of the Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm. And part of what we are kind of trying to think historically is exactly how did that how did the modern world emerge? What is the role of racialization in producing that world, and particularly, like the implementation of slavery and actually how it produced that extensive diaspora. The fact that labor was expropriated from bodies, those bodies were engaged in a process of dehumanization, where that first place, the Middle Passage, was precisely the violence that is wrought on that body that sort of dehumanizes it, and it builds up essentially a kind of condition of you've got docks and you've got warehouses and you've got auction blocks, and and that becomes a kind of architectural apparatus of slavery. But on the other hand, the profits that are made from all of the wheat and the tobacco and the indigo and the rice and the cotton, right, that is produced out of land that, quite frankly, Europeans stole from indigenous populations, nonetheless produces in architecture. This is where you get the neoclassicism of the banks, right, and the civic buildings. You get the Palladian great houses, for example, around England, the neo-Gothic houses, and you see these in the landscapes of the World's Fair in the 19th century. So, that is to say that architecture is in fact enmeshed in these very complicated histories, and in material ways, but also intellectual ways, which is why we wanted to bring in the question of Hegel. But fundamentally, how have Black people thought otherwise and imagined themselves elsewhere in other possible futures, right? And so if the question, which is why we bring up Hegel in history, that there is this thing called progress, that white civilization is going to lead brown and Black people forward, right? And these are precisely the spaces, that were mentioned earlier. I think Sekou mentioned them about the school, right? The prison, these are the spaces to discipline bodies, right? In that march to make them, right, operate within the kind of modern society. That Black people have found other spaces, in fact, in which to begin to imagine that. And that's precisely where we find the Afro-imaginary. It is precisely in poetry and music. It's in dance, as we've seen. It's in novels, it's in arts, it's in graffitis, and it's all of these artistic forms. It's definitely in cooking in terms of the spaces that are made around those rituals. But these create spaces of Blackness and offer spaces for Black being to think and act outside of these regulated and surveilled dominions of modern racialized life. And there's a quote that Robin Kelly writes where he says that, quote, "In the poetics of struggle and lived experience, in the utterances of ordinary folks, in the cultural products of social movements, in the reflections of activists, we discover many different cognitive maps of the future of a world not yet born." And so as Robin acutely posits, it is the struggle and the lived experience that creates a plethora of poetic actions that continually reconstitute and reframe the forces of racialization and oppression that was birthed with the modernity that we in fact just have described. That imaginary can be found in the everyday spaces of Black life, in the quotidian, the mundane, or even the banal. And so it's perhaps these small acts in the everyday spaces, in the kitchen, the stoop, the corner, the barbershop, the hair salon, and elsewhere, that remake big A architecture in ways that resonate in the imagination. A Black future, a world not yet born. Thank you. So next we will have a presentation from Ingrid Lefleur.
Wow, that was awesome. This is beautiful. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be here, and I've heard so much about this conference. I wanted to talk about my run for mayor in Detroit that happened this summer. I think I want to start with thinking about our relationship between government and the citizen. So in Detroit, we have many neighborhoods that look like this. This is my grandmother's home. It was set on fire earlier this spring. And it's just one example of many where people are living in pretty kind of harsh environments, even if your house is intact, right? And that's what's across the street from her. And it's very emotional for any person who lives in Detroit and you're returning home and you see your neighborhood ravished. So essentially, citizens of Detroit are feeling very invisible. And they don't feel like their voices are being heard. And if anything, they feel penalized. I'm sure you've heard about the water shutoffs that are happening in Detroit. Over 18,000 homes were faced with water shutoffs this summer. So when I'm thinking about running for mayor, I have to really understand the people that I love, that I call my Detroit family, that I'm talking to. The trauma in which they're living in and that they're facing. And they know for a fact their voices are not being heard. So that means that developing a platform is very essential to be human-centered. And that is exactly what I ran on. This is a bus stop in front of City Hall. So if you have to go and do business, you're greeted with metal detectors and nice plexiglass. Nothing about it is enjoyable. Nothing about the experience. So I really wanted to make sure that there was a love that's communicated in everything that I did when I was running for mayor. And that this could be pleasurable. So I used, of course, the framework of Afrofuturism, because I do believe that not just aesthetically, but even through its principles, it can heal Black bodies. This is a logo by Ethan Payne. We decided on a seal that is very similar to Detroit's seal. I launched at this art space called 1 Mile, and the party was called Detroit is the Future. I asked 6 different DJs to come, and they all have their own network. This is very, very important. Detroit is culturally segregated and racially segregated. And I really wanted to make sure that from the start, we're setting a tone for the future that we want to manifest. And so I basically try to create my own utopia. So the spectrum of humanity was represented at this launch, and people really, really enjoyed it because we're not used to coming together in one space like that. It was a really fun moment, for sure. My platform is not only about being human-centered, but it was also about co-creation, which is one of the main principles of Afrofuturism. And I wanted to make sure that people understood that they were part of this mayoral campaign. It wasn't just about me and my ideas and what I wanted. I really wanted to make sure that they were included and that whatever plan of action I created reflected their ideas and their voices. So I held co-creation sessions in my campaign office. They happened weekly and for about 2 hours at a time, if not more. It was very difficult to get them out of the campaign office. We would talk about various topics like the cannabis industry. Right now we have over 100 dispensaries in Detroit and only about 4 or 5 are Black owned. So I really wanted to make sure that as we were thinking, medical marijuana is legal. But I wanted to make sure that people understood that there is a business and what was happening before we fully legalized, hopefully in 2018. This is the co-creation session office. The artwork that you're seeing was created by Dogon Kriga. And this is Ife Bess and Onyx Ashanti. Onyx Ashanti 3D prints everything that you're seeing that he's playing. And he usually is at 1 Mile and he teaches people 3D printing. So we're talking about decentralized production, which is another form. This is a future that I would love to manifest. This is some of the marketing material that we used. and we created a song. So basically, one of the things that is really important is that Afrofuturism is based in a place of love, and we don't really get that from politicians. That authenticity usually isn't communicated because that's a risk. And I believe that love creates an atmosphere of trust, which then creates pleasure. And as a result of the campaign, I got so many different people saying that they voted, like these two, who never ever really voted before. It goes kind of against their own philosophy about government. And that's what it's about inspiring people to participate, but at the same time, government, or in my case, the politician, has to make the effort to say, hey, I'm open to you, and I love you, and I appreciate you, and you are visible to me. I just wanted to quickly read what my plan of action that came out of the co-creation sessions. This is the first paragraph. Our current economy is based on exploitation and extraction of talent, skills, and labor. Detroit is in need of a new economy that uplifts a new value system. The current economic and government systems are outdated ways of operating and uphold beliefs and values misaligned with the citizens of Detroit. We are in need of a true democratic governance and community ownership. By focusing on the root cause of systematic oppression, we can end the cycle of poverty, create a future where wealth creation is a tool of the people. A new system, a new economy that meets human needs, enhances the quality of life, and allows us to live in balance with nature. I, after that, discussed how Detroit needs to create a universal basic income, half of which should be in fiat currency and the other half on cryptocurrency. I believe through the development of a cryptocurrency, we can hopefully create a decentralized government that actually reflects the needs of the people. And that, to me, is an Afrofuturist framework for politics. I think my time is up. Thank you very much. One second. And now we have Joaquin Garrett.
Wow. So many levels, I'm truly appreciative and honored to be here. Thank you to the team that put the event together. It's really a blessing to be amongst, such brilliance from our community, I always like to say, we are the wealth. So, I appreciate the opportunity to share about some of the work that we've been doing in Seattle with Africatown to create space for the brilliance among us to be able to express itself, to design built environments and otherwise that will bring the best out of us. So a little about me. I'm a third-generation community builder. I like to say my grandfather was one of the co-founders of the first and only black bank in Washington State and west of the Mississippi. And my father was human rights, a freedom fighter. And this picture you see, I'm 8 years old, and this is part of the occupation of a school building, which turned out to be the longest occupation of or active civil disobedience in U.S. history, and now it's an African-American museum in our school, and that's what it was occupied for, in objection to them building a police precinct in the middle of the black community. These two young lights are my real motivation on a daily basis, and so, yeah, I mean, it speaks for itself, right? Making sure they have a world where they can really grow and be safe and really realize the gifts that they came with. So now we'll get into a little bit about the Seattle story. So, video.
Beauty, brilliance, and resilience of the African diaspora community and legacy in Seattle. The Central District became the center of African American life within Seattle in 1890, when William Gross built his home on the 12 acres of land he purchased from Henry Yesler. Discriminatory policies such as housing covenants forced blacks who had migrated to Seattle from the South to buy and live in the Central District. Undeterred by these occurrences, they built a community alongside the Italian, Jewish, Japanese, and Filipino residents and contributed to much of the cultural and social development we see in the city today. That very community has become the soul of Seattle, cultivating greatness with the likes of the Jackson Street Jazz legacy, Quincy Jones, Ray Charles, Ernestine Anderson, and Jimi Hendrix, while fostering the changes occurring with the civil rights movement and the budding hip-hop culture. The 1980s and 90s brought a large migration of Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Somalian residents, adding new layers of flavor and cultural richness to the Central District. Many blacks also expanded their home base to South Seattle and South King County. Today, the Central District remains the heart and home to a myriad of businesses of the African diaspora, including cuisine from the South, the Caribbean, Chad, Ethiopia, Morocco, Mali, and more. These things, coupled with the rich history of the residing black community, have made Africatown Central District a unique place with very distinctive narratives. Africatown Black Seattle Tour takes you on a journey through one of the nation's hidden jewels of African and African American life. Unearth all that it has to offer today.
All right, so little insight into what I call a hidden treasure of black life in America, as you heard. The very first black resident that's known in Seattle was a man by the name of Manuel Lopez, and he was from Cape Verde off the coast of West Africa. I know there's a large Cape Verdean population in this area, and he actually came to Seattle from New Bedford, Massachusetts, so a little connection. No love for the Patriots, but, you know, some love for the people, you know. You saw in the video, you heard how, you know, like many black communities, as blacks migrated from the South, seeking better qualities of life, really as refugees of the transatlantic slave trade or African Holocaust or Ma'afa, they still met obstacles, housing covenants and things of that nature that forced them to settle in a community called the Central District or Africatown. And despite those obstacles, a very rich community was born. As you saw, it was a community of homeowners, of people really making a better way. But we're still, as you see, some of the people that came out of the community, but still face the red line, the white flight, divestment, and ultimately just benign neglect, and then drugs and mass incarceration, which came through a policy called Weed and Seed, which was a federal policy which 30 years later we can see who the weeds were and who the seeds were as a result of gentrification. And so the question became, where are we in 2017? On one side, you see a tourist map. So if you came into Seattle, you got a map. You see various communities. You don't see the Central District or Africatown represented. On the right, you see an advertisement for a new commercial space and a new development, you know, and all of the businesses highlighted are businesses that actually cater to the new residents of the community. None of the legacy businesses are there. And every other week, it's like there's a eulogy being written in the paper about our community and what it was and what it's not. You know, black is, black ain't. And all too often, we see our most prized treasures are young people being found and showing up in places here. And so we answered that question, where are we? We took a cue from our Pan-Asian Chinatown neighbors, brothers and sisters not far from us, and we said, we're here. A declarative statement, an affirmative statement, a projective statement of us into the future of the city of Seattle. There's a saying, without vision, the people perish. And we saw that my generation was not handed a clear vision forward for the community, and so we self-determined our own that would embrace our history. The original Africa Town was just outside of Mobile, Alabama, founded by Africans who were on one of the last illegal slave ships and who couldn't go back home, and so they settled a community. And we also embraced the fact that we have a large migration of East African, Somali, Eritrean, Ethiopian in our community, and bringing new flavors of richness and facets to the jewel that we are. And so Africa Town is really about maintaining and developing a space where we actually capture the value of our culture. This is one of the largest corporations based in Seattle, which was built off a piece of African culture, the Ethiopian coffee ceremony. And so we know how many times that we have given value and not seen the benefits of it. And we see cranes all over, and we saw that nothing was being built for us. We looked into our comprehensive plan, Seattle 2035, and I didn't see those two beautiful young men in the future of this city. And so we started our own process, again, to self-determine a future. You know that so often who the first person killed in the movie is, right? So we had to take the script and write ourselves into the end of it, and we channeled our historical legacy as architects, as from Imhotep's spirit, you know, to the Moorish architecture and design legacy, to Timbuktu, to Benjamin Banneker, to our Black Wall Streets, and took this as our reference points for building a new community into the future. We captured ideas from our community through various engagement events, and we got support. And we developed our own vision for a cultural innovation, not just an arts district or historic district that makes us museum pieces or amenities for a new community, but to look at innovation which is relevant to the economy. And we created our own innovation hub. We got support from the esteemed Dr. Sutton, who presented and ran a studio to come up with ideas around Afrocentric design. And we realized we had to own the land. So we began strategizing on how to own the land, and we formed a community land trust. And our first project broke ground in Juneteenth of this year. That's a groundbreaking. And just yesterday, we closed on the acquisition of our second site right across the street from here, which will allow for another 100+ units, keeping us in the community. And we continue to imagine, with the support of people like Sarah Zowdy, who's leading our Africa Town Community Design Cipher, to imagine, oh, wow, okay, she's the reason I'm here. And so we're here to ask you to help contribute to this vision, contribute your ideas to our collective vision of a community that represents the beauty, the brilliance, and the best of the Black experience in the African diaspora. Thank you.
Thank you all for the presentations. Can you guys hear me? Okay, there we go. Thank you all very much. And I will have to remark, as everyone else has, that it is remarkable to be sitting up here and seeing who we're seeing out in this audience today. So thank you for joining. This session is called Design Futuring. And so it's really thinking about how we as designers are going to be a part of a better future, right, for our communities and for, you know, the world in general. And we have a couple of people who are actively involved in that. We have a couple of other people who are actively involved in thinking about and promoting that through their work and through their academic practices. But I want to start by addressing this false binary of social impact design and good design or great design, right? That is a false binary. All design is social impact design. And Mabel has a great study that she's done, Who Builds Your Architecture, which a colleague, Mark Mulligan, turned me on to recently. And it's really sort of an empowering thing for us as designers to see how our designs and how the building of the built environment is actually impacting communities that we might not be thinking about in that process. Every process, every decision, every design decision has a social impact, whether it be the policies of the 50s and 60s, urban renewal, federal highway acts, redlining, the construction of ghettos, et cetera. Even more recently, the sort of invention of the poor door, which I don't know if you guys know about that in New York City, where you have mixed income housing, but there is a door for some people and a door for other people. And so that is a social impact design, right? Not in a positive way, but it is. So I want to sort of address that. I want to first look at it from this sort of connecting history to the present to the future, and move towards the present now and ask, I think, Ingrid and Joaquin, in what ways has design contributed positively to your social impact agendas, and in what ways has it not really lived up to its potential, and how can we begin to reimagine that? And then for Mario and Mabel, from an academic perspective, since we are in the academy, we are talking about design futuring, and this is the design futuring crowd that we're looking at. How can we address design curriculum to bring in this, or to blur or erase this false binary of social impact being something different than what great design can be?
Okay, I guess I'll go first. So one thing I love about Afrofuturism is that, I enjoy the assumptions that are made about Afrofuturism. So a lot of people believe that it's only for Black people, and only Black people will be interested in it, and it's not very inclusive. And actually, many different types of people are into Afrofuturism. So when you're using that aesthetic, you're actually attracting such a wide group of people, which is really beautiful, because we are centering Blackness and Black bodies. And so, that right there, I think, is a success all unto itself. And is a surprise for a lot of people. But I guess for me, in this instance, only 13% of Detroit voters voted in the primary. And so my attempts to kind of be a little radical, yes, it inspired a lot of voters to vote who probably wouldn't have voted before. And with these statements that they voted with a full heart, which is really beautiful, that they really believed finally in someone. But then at the same time, it might not have grabbed everyone. And maybe, that design didn't really communicate in the way that it should have. But at the same time, I'm an artist and a curator running for office. So, it definitely, people were on the fence about me specifically. But my campaign was very curious. But, it was kind of an expectation that I would have, a beautiful logo or all these different things. But it didn't necessarily communicate to them that I could probably hold office. And
So-
that's, yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
so on in that sort of trajectory, you sort of are picking up on what many designers really focus on, which is sort of the product, the design, the image. But maybe you can expand a little bit on the design of the process, and as well, Joaquin, the design of the process of getting this underway, and the co-creation that you mentioned.
Oh, yes. So the process was extremely successful, simply because people have never been asked by a politician to sit down for 2 hours and please share your ideas. The reason I did that is because the people who are dealing with the issues know the solutions better than anybody else, because they've been thinking about it for a long time. The challenges kind of force you to figure out a solution on the ground without government help, right? So that's why Detroit is known for our resiliency. And that was really wonderful. I really enjoyed that. And it was, I can't really say anything that didn't necessarily work with that. The cannabis co-creation session, I will say, was the largest one that I had. So I kind of hope that people would have come out for the climate change conversation or adult literacy and tax foreclosures. But I think that whoever did come out, it was very important for me to really understand a very holistic view of the issue. You always think you know the issue until you start talking to people who are dealing with the issue.
And Joaquin, how you mentioned the work, the studio work with Dr. Sutton. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that process was and how that was empowering, or was could have been done differently, or what you would do next time because it worked so well? Could you elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. I'd like to back up just a little bit first on the design piece, and that is the design of a narrative, right? And so Africatown is about taking control and really redesigning the narrative of who we are and what our space is, because the narrative has been Africa is a dark continent, black communities are dark places to avoid, they're just negative, they're ghetto, they're the hood, but yet all this richness, whether us or natural resources that are powering the world, are coming from these spaces. So that was the first part, because even as a, black American or West Indian / Black American or whatever, descendant of universal architects and master builders, we had to even deal with resistance in the black community, right? And so we had to make a choice. It was a design choice to be asset-based, right? To not focus on our deficits, right? In designing such a narrative. And then the logo, right? The initial logo that we used to take something from an abstract, word concept that we're talking about to something that was inspiring to people was one level of design, where design helped our process. And then the next process, I would say, I can't speak directly to the studio, but I can speak to how the studio and the product of the studio helped open people's mind to what was possible. So when you saw those images, and when those images were delivered to our community, which have constantly kind of bought into the narrative of the vanishing black community, what we had, and just really defeated, and a lot of apathy. So when we brought those images, it really opened people's minds and inspired other people to get involved and kept the process moving. And be it at the time, this was the last developable square block in a highly gentrifying community, rapidly gentrifying community. It was a $25 million, price tag, and no one thought we could do anything, right? But these images, these designs helped us move the narrative, get people inspired that then got involved, and then we were able to, again, make an acquisition to build another building. So I think it was very important, that part of it. And then the other part is that we have to battle with, we partnered with nonprofit developer, and then they have their chosen design firm, and they think they know everything, and they really don't want to slow down to engage the community that's being designed for. So we had to fight around build with rather than build for, which is another, design choice on the first project. And so we're in front of the second project. So we're gonna, flex a little little stronger on this one in terms of how we design, and hopefully we get some ideas from some of the brilliant people in the room about things that we could bring to life. So we're really just, my role is really helping to create space for what is imagined in the Afrofuturism to actually take root and have a field operation to grow in our community in real time now.
So moving to Mario and Mabel, listening to that, and also sort of bringing up one of the points that you were making strongly in your presentation, which is that the future is intrinsically connected to history. Like, you can't separate those two. The future will only be what the history can lead up to. So we have to choose now how we choose what path we take to the next phase. But looking at design, education, and pedagogy, you know, there are people who I would bet on graduate from these top schools and don't know what urban renewal was, or don't know sort of these histories that design and designers are directly implicated in. So from a histories and theories perspective, what are we missing in terms of equipping students with an understanding of the past? And from a sort of studio culture perspective, what are we missing in getting more people like this room to be everyone, right? Like, this shouldn't be a room of like-minded people. This should be a world of like-minded people from the design community. And so how do we take that step from a pedagogical perspective?
History theory piece?
Take the design side. Okay. So you go first.
All right. Well, I think you know, what you said initially about sort of process is really key. I mean, I consider myself, you know, kind of diehard modernist, although Mabel has me kind of rethinking that. But I've always been, you know, sort of, you know, just fascinated by modern architecture. But I realized in school that it was insufficient in certain ways in terms of what I was really interested in. And as we said, you know, the imaginary, it exists in music, it exists in art, it exists in other forms of cultural expression, cultural representation. And so in terms of the studio and the studio sort of environment, what we've both tried to do is bring in artists, for example. So working with Nonsi Matuti, you know, who's an artist and who has a sort of practice which spans from printmaking to web design to different things. Bringing in artists, we neglected to mention.
There's Lake.
Yes, there's Lake Jaifus, who's here. And so some of the, you know, the work from the summer workshop that we ran in Harare, we brought Lake in for a couple of days, and, you know, and Lake sort of worked with the students to develop other techniques in terms of representation, so that we weren't relying on those Bauhaus methods of representation that we learned as undergraduates, you know, those kind of strict rules of modernism, but finding other ways of representing it and imagining. So because I think that, yes, the future is tied to history, but that future is also related to that teleology, which goes back to Hegel. And that's something that we want to break away from. So is there another way of imagining what a future might be, which is what we call the imaginary, rather than the future?
Yeah, and also I think strategically, you know, there was a really fantastic conversation about how do you get people into design fields, right? And you really, absolutely, you got to get them young, right? To think about their world and their environment in many ways. And then there's the question of, okay, once you're a designer, what do you do, or how do you practice? And I think there are amazing examples of, you know, like ways in which, you know, an architectural design education can actually lead to. But what happens in between in these institutions that we come into, you know, which people have already said, I don't feel comfortable with the tools or the environment or the, you know, but you also have to start to unpack, challenge, rewrite, rescript, tear down, and change those environments, the institutions, you know, that we work within, because otherwise, you know, getting there and what you pass through isn't going to really impact how you know, sort of practice on the other end. So it really is challenging, I think, studio culture, other ways in which you can learn, other references that you can draw into your work. I also think, like, history in architecture is a monster, you know, and it does. I mean, it tells the history from a European perspective. Like, I had Sir Bannister Fletcher, and if you look at the chart of Sir Bannister Fletcher, there are the primitive cultures all the way at the bottom, Persians, Africans, Egyptian, and then you have Gothic, and in the American version, America is up at the top. It's like, what is that? Like, why is it privileging whiteness? This is the pyramid. But you're learning these things unself-consciously. You don't realize that's what you're learning, and then simultaneously being alienated from. And so I think there's a lot of unpacking of that in order to kind of change what it is that we're actually learning collectively. I don't just mean for Black and brown folks, but I also mean, for students who are coming from elsewhere, Americans. I mean, all of this really has to be challenged and unpacked.
Yeah, and I think, even the history curriculum has to be challenged. I mean, I recall in my American history course at Columbia, Paul Williams was nowhere mentioned. Who's the architect responsible for building, most of Los Angeles? But, that was not part of the curriculum, which is why I think, even as students, we have to kind of challenge the curriculum that we're being sort of fed.
Yeah, I think that's actually what I think these students have done and are doing with these kinds of events, which I hope can be every year, not every other year. But how much time do we have for the left? We have enough time to open up? Okay, let's open up for questions.
Hi. So first, I just want to say it's really cool to see the two of you on the stage representing Detroit and Seattle. I was born in Detroit, and that was where I spent half of my childhood, and then the other half was spent in Seattle. And so I've got a lot of questions about those communities in particular that maybe we can ask you guys later. But there was a mention of creating spaces in your case, like for co-creation and spaces to draw out those voices that are important in these processes. So I'm curious, kind of, what do those spaces look and feel like, and kind of what tools that you find are working with in these communities to get the things you guys were, designing for?
Food.
Well, for the co-creation session, I made sure that we all sat in a circle. My campaign office, I should first say, I have my Afrotopia archive there, so I collect film and literature and graphic novels, all Afrofuturist. And anyone can take it, and they don't have to return it. The rule is that they have to pass it on when they're done. And then I also had black dolls for children to play with and fresh flowers. And I just tried to make a non-campaign office. I didn't want it to, I've only probably been to one campaign office in my life prior to running. And so I really wanted to make it sure that it wasn't, cold and sterile and all about like calling people and begging them to vote for me. It was really warm. And intentionally so, and we always provided water and snacks and things of that sort. I didn't really control the conversation. So I would just start it off like, hey, this is what I really want to know about. This is kind of what I'm thinking. Please tell me if I'm right or wrong. And then people just kind of went for it. And usually the conversation was between people and so on and so forth. And so, it just became this super safe place, hyper diverse, people from all walks of life. I just really wanted to make sure that this was a place of transformation, that we were focusing on these solutions and really trying to manifest these kinds of futures that we're imagining, but in a real viable way, because Detroit absolutely needs it.
We spent maybe a year and a half, and it's really still ongoing with, if you saw at one of the last slides, it said it was Imagine Africatown, and what would you like to see inspired by something that has moved you or you recognize has impacted the world from the Black experience or the African diaspora, regardless of geography or time. So we went out, at all of the events that we convened, we would, let people put their information down. And then we also went to a lot of different community events and met people on those terms and got their ideas. We just gave a prompt and let people respond. And so we got a rich, database of inspiration, and then kind of catalog from what's the lowest hanging fruit to, something that might take more resources, and then begin to put some of those things into activation, or to make people aware if we already had something like that in the community that people may not be aware of. But I think also just having small wins and continuously building momentum and always reporting back and engaging with the community, again, has been helpful to our process. And so always, bringing it back. And then when we do events, we kind of do them more on our terms. We have a mayoral election, and we have a candidate forum coming up, and we had a DJ and performance. I mean, so it's not, your average, engagement event. It's more responsive to our cultural preferences and whatnot.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Tyler Blackburn. I work for Youth Build Boston, which is a nonprofit. My question for you guys are, how do we make sure, because I'm actually kind of worried about, in our effort to call out and highlight Blackness amongst all disciplines, that we're going to eventually in the future have these situations where we just have tokens. So sort of like having Black History Month and highlighting Black history only in that month, and then that way people go, oh, well, you have your thing, as opposed to the reality is Black history is American history. We're part of all of it. And so how do we integrate ourselves into those spaces instead of just avoiding the times where we just have these tokens that just say you have your thing now?
No, I think a lot of kind of what's talked about today is understanding, what is Black being? What is Blackness as an aesthetic category? But it's also in the context of a lot of anti-Blackness, and that has a kind of history and a legacy. And I think it's important to sort of recognize these, and that there are multiple ways of kind of engaging. I think this is kind of what I think is the brilliance of this conference, is that it shows you there are many, many, many different platforms through which you can engage it, so that it doesn't, I wouldn't worry about the singularity, in fact, because I do think, I think this room sort of shows you that there are these kind of multiple efforts, multiple platforms, multiple ways of working and thinking that really show the kind of nuances, right? The kind of panel before us around gender, there are questions around sexuality. I mean, it's not a monolith of Blackness. It's very, very complicated, right? Set of kind of constellation of relationships that's quite dynamic. And, and Blackness is beautiful, so I don't have a problem with its condition.
And I also think it's important that we find ways in which our work becomes a part of the canon, whether that means that we have to write it in there, we have to produce it, that it becomes part of what's then sort of taught to future generations, that it's not just in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but it's also in the Museum of Modern Art. We have to be there.
Yeah, and I just want to, one example is, we did this amazing workshop in Johannesburg where our students work with South African students, and we work with street traders on Bree Street in downtown Johannesburg. One of those students who was there decided that was going to be her thesis project, and she was interested in street performers and the ways in which they are actually resisting a certain image of the public that the city wants to promote through redevelopment and gentrification. And she worked on this for a year and discovered how the city is trying to keep them out of the streets. But one of the things she had to do work on, as a young white woman, was her whiteness in that space. And she did the work, which is pretty phenomenal in that project. She understood so much. She got grants from the university. She developed a pamphlet to help street traders navigate essentially the permitting process to make sure that they're understood as a valuable public resource. And so now her project is affecting public policy in Johannesburg about the way, the downtown is. But I think it's because she was willing to sort of do the work, think through her whiteness in relationship to the racialized spaces that she was engaging in, that it becomes productive. So I think it can be a collective and not just a Black experience of Blackness.
Can I add to that?
Yeah,
Just,
go ahead.
if we look at from Elvis to hip hop, we don't have to always project for what we do to be absorbed, broadly, right? Like hip hop is a global culture impacting, all. You look at the Black Panthers and when they started and just the Black freedom struggles and then all the movements, you had the Brown Berets, American Indian movement, other people start to become, Chicano studies, Asian studies departments, so, in Seattle, just our most recent experience is that as we moved on the issues that were affecting us, other communities began to take inspiration to that and then stand up and look at the things that we were doing as a model. And really, Africatown kind of became the leading voice or vanguard for equitable and inclusive development in Seattle, which is a big issue right now with the rapid growth that's happening in the city. So I do also appreciate the fact of writing it in and, being able to have people that are in these spaces and document it. That also is important. But those words, cultural appropriation, don't worry about your stuff not making it to other people's accounts.
So we technically only have time for one more question.
So this is what, since we only have time.
Because I promised 2 people they could ask, I'm going to have them ask their questions in succession, and then you guys respond to both of them. And for everyone else who has asked to ask a question, please talk to folks and continue to have these conversations. But I'm going to have Tony ask a question and then this gentleman ask a question.
That's perfect. And since we are running out of time, I also want to say after the 2 questions are asked, can we use those as kind of a wrap up of any other things you wanted to add so we can have closing statements as well?
Okay, hi. So Mabel, you were actually starting to get at my question with your previous response, which is, I was trying to scan the images you were showing during your Mario's presentation, and I suspect that you did not have studios full of Black kids from America, right? So it's a fairly diverse student body, I would guess.
Yes.
And you're also dealing with a context that is not American, right? And so race in America different than race in Africa. And I would like you to speak a little bit about, as professors, how you set an environment that allows for other types of students that are not of those populations. As we've been talking about, this is really everyone's issue to take on. How do you set a context that allows the non-student of color to kind of come into that space, acknowledge privilege, whiteness, whatever it is they're bringing to a studio problem that they may feel potentially a bit timid about how to engage? How do we do that? Because Sharon mentioned this in the last session, which is many of us, you and I, teach students who do not look like this room, but we feel the same responsibility to speak to them and those audiences in the same way we're speaking now. So you can just talk a little bit about, as professors, how you set an environment that allows that kind of conversation to happen honestly, and for on the back end, those folks to advance their thinking about how they approach the work.
Well, we're going to do the second question first.
Well, luckily my question is virtually identical. It's about, I'm not going to stand since I'm right in the front, but it's about, we talk about getting kids young and training them. There's a lot of great pipeline programs, and I find people having amazing success after architecture school in finding their own niche and finding their own self-expression. But we still have this problem, from a professor's point of view, where Black kids are still struggling in architecture school. And, I do whatever I can, and I'm sure you guys come across the same things, and all these experiments and these new ways of teaching that we're bringing into the studio are falling on white and Asian ears, and the Black kids are still not getting it. So I'm now reflecting on ways of just completely changing the model of teaching, changing the ways of curricular structure and things of that nature. So.
Yeah, no, again, I just think there are many ways in which, you can address these. One of the things, I teach a class on race and architecture, both at a master's and a doctoral level. And so again, we historians, like, we read Hegel, we read Kant, we read Loos, incredibly racialized, Frank Lloyd Wright, Louisa, like, we unpack, like, okay, where is the racial thinking in all of this stuff? And by historicizing, it helps people understand, like, all right, this is where my concept of understanding racial difference is. So it takes it off this uncomfortable contemporary plane to start to see it, kind of as an outcome of a historical condition, and in terms and ways in which people don't really even understand. Well, how do we get to think this way? And so that's one thing that's helpful, and actually it does kind of help to have these diverse kind of studios. I remember being in South Africa and having a conversation about race, environmental degradation, and violence with students from Medellin, Damascus, Beirut, Athens. I mean, people who have their own sorts, understand, the kind of oppression, violence of neoliberalism, disenfranchisement, dispossession. Indigenous. There were a couple of people from Ecuador in that studio, and so there are various ways, that people intersect from their own perspectives. I think in that, and can understand and relate.
Yeah, and I think that Tony's right. I mean, at Columbia, it's quite diverse. I would say that 30% of our student body is probably from Asia, from China, from Korea, from not as many from Japan. But what I found this past spring in taking my studio, we worked in Dakar, and about half of that studio were students from China. They were very, very curious, but also then very, very critical, because they also saw what's now sort of happening with Chinese influence on the African continent, and they were actually quite surprised by some of it, and then sort of critical. And so I think that they will take that back with them now that they have a certain understanding of what's going on,
Yeah. No, I actually had this really crazy project that Mario was a part of, that took our intellectual capital and actually brought it to HBCUs. And it was amazing, the outcome of that. It wasn't about poaching, it was about knowledge transfer. And I didn't realize it would end up being networks that would engage us as faculty, the faculty there, as well as the students. Let's just say institutional structures, both less maybe on our end, but also on their end, made it very challenging to continue that project. But I do want to get back to it, because the people, the connections that were made were quite extraordinary.
So any closing remarks that any of you have? The two at the end. Maybe we can start. Do you want to go last this time, since you went first? Okay. You want to go?
Well, if you don't have it, Yeah, no, I'll leave it to my last.
No, I would just like to say, and echo what everyone has said today, that this is quite incredible. I'm actually quite envious, and wish that we had this kind of thing at Columbia. Yes. So again, I would just like to thank the organizers. This has been an incredible sort of first day, or let's say second day. And I look forward to continuing this conversation this evening with our sort of closing plenary and reception, and then tomorrow with Tony and the workshop.
Yeah, no, I just want to do a plug very quickly. Mario and I are doing a workshop that's going to be it's a masterclass. I think, you've already done one in Lagos, correct? You're doing it next week as part of an exhibition that's being curated by Mpoma Tsipa and Andreas Lepek. I think it's called This Is Not a Refugee Camp, a kind of critical project of Africa and diaspora. And we're going to be doing a workshop sometime in January. So people who might be interested, particularly students who are interested in engaging in that workshop, please get in touch with Mario or myself, and we can send you information in about a month about that.
Expressing gratitude again. I would say when we started our Blacks Seattle 2035 Imagine Africa Town initiative, kind of one aspect of it was to hack gentrification and disrupt development, disrupt displacement. And you know, we've had some positive steps, but in the face of what we're facing, we need a lot of help. And I think that the ability to share ideas, share wins, share losses and challenges amongst this community and the extended community of people that are not here will unleash some power that can make some major impact in our communities across the country and probably the world. So I look forward to connecting with as many people as we can. And yeah, I'm here to learn and be inspired, and it's going good so far.
Right. I'm definitely inspired. This is the second time that I've spoken publicly about my campaign, and I like that it's forcing me to really organize my thoughts and really articulate it. I thank you for allowing me to do that with all of you. And disruption, just to piggyback of what you said, disrupt the political systems, and you can use design to do that. And please do it, because quite honestly, any of these changes that we're looking forward to, that we're imagining, they're not going to be sustainable in the system, the government system in which we're living. And it is imperative, this is not a dream, to think about decentralized government. We really need to kind of focus on maybe not just decentralized government, but systems that actually work for Black bodies, because none of these systems were made for our Black bodies to prosper. Thank you.
Thank you.